We want to keep the focus here on Palestine. We are going to move to our next guest, who is the first person who even told me the book Trinity of Fundamentals existed. But we're going to be talking to her about many things going on in terms of Palestine. Layan Sima Fuleihan, who's the education director at the People's Forum. Layan, as always, an honor to have you back with us.
It's great to be back with you.
Well, a lot of conversation, a lot of talk now over whether or not there will or will not be a ceasefire. I think a lot of people, often get confused because there's shuttle diplomacy and this proposal and that proposal. But of course, I think what a lot of people in the United States are thinking about is Biden's, ice cream trip where he said there's going to be a ceasefire by Monday. So where does this stand? I mean, how realistic does it seem that could happen? And what are some of the proposals that are on the table?
Well, it's honestly a bit unclear because thanks to Biden and his unwillingness to provide any restraint on the Israelis and his unwillingness to actually engage in what would be real negotiations, an actual ceasefire isn't currently on the table. The latest draft of the proposal, I think actually it was talked about on the show a couple of weeks ago, end of January. There was this Paris paper that was presented to the Palestinian resistance that would outline a three-phased ceasefire that had different phases with different requirements that would need to be met. The latest draft that was delivered earlier this week actually has thrown out the idea of a permanent ceasefire. Right now, what's being debated is the conditions for a temporary truce. And Biden, the U.S. administration, for the first time used the word ceasefire in their proposal to the UN not so long ago. You can definitely tell that they're feeling the heat and that they would like us to think that they're working towards a ceasefire. But if you actually look at what they are pushing, they are asking for really, they're asking for the release of all the Israelis who are being held now by the resistance in Gaza, and giving very little back to the Palestinian people for what would be a temporary truce. And we know what happened last time there was a temporary truce. The killing didn't stop. The sniper attacks didn't stop. The bombardments didn't stop. This morning, the massacre that the world woke up to was absolutely horrific. So it's really difficult to understand this as negotiations. What it really feels more like is blackmail. Biden and Netanyahu are in their own different ways saying, if you don't agree to our terms, we will escalate the massacre. Biden, by saying that a ceasefire deal will be reached on Monday without any real proof, in a sense, really only puts pressure on the resistance and is making promises that are really not confirmed to be achievable, and is raising people's hopes in a way that is very misleading. And so I think we have to be alert to the role the United States is actually playing in this process. And right now, concretely, what they're doing, despite the fact that they would like us to think that they are concerned for Palestinian civilian life, right now what they're doing is trying to force an Israeli victory on the Palestinian people by creating conditions that are absolutely untenable for sustaining life.
It's really shocking, Layan, just how far the U.S. is willing to support this barbarity. I mean, I'm sure you saw it was about a week ago that we saw this report by a group of UN experts talking about evidence that the Israelis are systematically sexually assaulting Palestinian women and girls. And the stories are horrific. And the U.S. spokespeople basically brushed it aside as, oh, Israel will investigate it. This isn't a credible investigation. You also have the fact that today the Israelis fired at people and killed over 100 people, I believe, 100 Palestinians who were waiting for food aid, as they used starvation as a weapon, which they were clear about back in October when Yoav Gallant talked about essentially starving, quote unquote, human animals in Gaza of food and water. And here we are, where now in north of Gaza, you've got babies dying of malnutrition. It just feels so unbelievably depraved because it is. And then you have the self-immolation of Aaron Brushnell. I'm just curious if you can comment on the different aspects of that, because I think for a lot of people right now, especially those who have become active around this issue, it's a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness as almost 5 months into this genocide, There seems to be no end in sight. And our leadership in the US seems perfectly willing to continue to arm the Israelis as they impose a siege of like mass starvation.
Well, it's definitely true that the US administration is perfectly willing to carry out a genocide. They've been backing Israel unconditionally for much longer than the past couple of months. And Israel has been a state with a genocidal project for much longer than the past couple of months. The difference is that right now there's no excuse to not be able to see it. It's being live streamed in extreme amounts. The escalation is to extreme conditions. What happened this morning is absolutely horrific. What happened and what the US media definitely will not be reporting on is that actually the Israeli occupation forces suffered a defeat in another neighborhood of Gaza City called Zaytun, and they were forced to withdraw. And instead of just withdrawing, they took out their frustration by shooting on people who had been waiting since the night before for aid. This is a section of Gaza that has been surviving on animal feed. And the first time a flour truck would enter into the region and give people some relief from living on not human grade edible food. They've been surviving on animal feed and barely enough of that as it is. They opened fire on these people who are seeking aid. They used tanks to run over people. They shot at people's upper bodies. And then Israeli spokespeople said that this was actually the deaths were caused by a stampede. It's blatant lies. There's Israeli sources as well who have confirmed that this was a direct assault on the people who were seeking aid. This is supposedly a humanitarian corridor where this was happening. And it's just blatantly obvious that there is a desire for extermination on the behalf of the Israeli occupation. They also took a number of people to an undisclosed area. They've been doing this repeatedly over the past couple months, where they kidnap large groups of Palestinians and detain them and torture them in other places and don't release what they're doing. So that again happened. It's really, really horrific. And people are now there is no excuse for anyone to be able to deny the genocidal nature of the Israeli project. And if you think about it, the entire Israeli society is conditioned for this. People are forced to do or highly pressured. It's very extreme if you don't do it because you'll go to jail. People are forced to serve in the Israeli occupation forces when they're teenagers. They're brainwashed constantly with their own political leaders calling for the mass extermination of Palestinian people, comparing them to animals. This didn't just start happening since October 7. This has been the status quo since before. But now it's visible to everyone. And I think a major reason why it's visible to everyone is actually the mass mobilizations. It would be a lot different if people weren't constantly putting pressure on the US government, putting pressure on the media, making it so that people cannot ignore the reality and that the US and their Zionist partners cannot control the narrative. That has played a major element in how Biden and the Israelis are assessing the correlation of forces and trying to move forward. It's horrific what is happening, absolutely horrific. But Biden is very fully aware that he cannot continue to give a blank check to the Israelis to execute genocide without suffering consequences at home. There's been now we're coming near on his re-election campaign, and massive numbers of people, unprecedented numbers of people have voted uncommitted in the Democratic primaries. Besides that, neither him nor anyone else who is pro-genocide is able to have a moment's peace. They're constantly being followed, tagged. All their events are being disrupted. Mass mobilizations are reaching a level that we have not seen before in history for the Palestinian cause. And we're actually coming up on a global day of action that is shaping up to be one of the most significant yet. Many countries across the world are participating. Cuba just announced that it's putting out a call for national mobilizations. Over 50 countries in the 50 cities, in the United States are going to be participating. So I think it's important to show that while the U.S. government is acting with military might, it is acting with unconditional support to Israel, despite some of the kind of discourse maneuvers it wants to make, the mass mobilizations are significant, are having an impact, and they are being seen and witnessed by people on the ground in Gaza and in Palestine. And it's very important that we keep them up and that we keep putting on the pressure and make it so that it is extremely untenable for these politicians to continue their policy of extermination against the Palestinian people without consequence.
No, I think it's an extraordinarily important point. And about an hour ago, President Gustavo Petro of Colombia announced that they're suspending arms sales. And if you know anything about that, the security relationship between Colombia and Israel is very significant. So that in and of itself is significant. Well, you already sort of spoke to it, Layan, I think in terms of what we are seeing in terms of the growth of mass movements and protest. And I mean, it really does feel like in some ways, that's a key part of this story is I think that despite this huge amount of mass killing, 30,000 people, really more than that, obviously, when we include those who continue to be trapped under the rubble, well over 70,000 people have been injured, many of them really maimed in ways that will change their lives forever. Obviously, the psychological trauma of every single person, that's in any way, shape, or form adjacent to this. But I say all that to say that despite all of that, it feels that they have been unable to actually crush the resilience of the people of Gaza and Palestine in general and the will to resist. And it feels that in and of itself is one of the factors that's inspiring people to keep going, because it is, I think for most of us outside of it, almost borderline miraculous to see that despite all of this, there's still so much resilience. The videos you see coming out of Gaza, the kids protesting for food, all these different things that, it's terrible to see, but it really does say something. And it feels like that's a big catalyst for this. And also maybe the biggest Achilles heel for the strategy of the U.S. and others, because I think they were hoping that there would be more sort of grinding down of Palestinians, but people continue to stand upright.
Absolutely. I mean, they keep on making the same mistake over and over in history. You'd think that they might learn by now that you can't colonize a people and then expect them to just take it. In fact, the Palestinian struggle is one that is full of principle. It is full of dignity, and this is something that you can't break in the human spirit by just terror and by trying to make the world forget about it. In fact, Israel has not managed to achieve its military goals. They are trying now to force a military victory through what they're calling negotiations, which again are being done under conditions of starvation, under conditions of genocide. You cannot negotiate when one of the partners is being held with a knife to the throat. And I think I'm losing the connection. Am I still there?
We got you.
Okay, great. And a big part of this battle has consistently been the battle for public opinion and the battle for the control over the narrative. And we've seen how much money the Zionist institutions have put and thrown into making sure that the pro-Israel narrative is dominant, especially in the US and Europe. The mass mobilization and the mass movement for Palestine across the world has destroyed this front of the struggle. I mean, they have totally destroyed the control over the narrative at this point. It really have put Israel on the defensive in an extreme. And now the question is whether or not they are going to be able to find excuses for what they're doing. And they're trying to find excuses. You saw that with the massacre this morning. They said, well, no, actually it wasn't us. It was a stampede. But they are cracking at the seams. Lloyd Austin today said he admitted to 25,000 deaths of women and children in Palestine, and the Pentagon quickly tried to correct that statement. They said, we can't confirm any of the casualties that have been reported by the Gaza Health Ministry. Well, too bad, because the entire world is confirming it for you. I mean, the movement now has become the source of information and the source of confirmation for what is actually happening, and has been witnessing the resilience of the Palestinian people that is not new, that has been resisting since 75 years, also under conditions of genocide. And what's different now is that the entire world is cognizant to it, is recognizing it, and is very inspired by the strength of the Palestinian people, who have managed to maintain and managed to not close the question of the colonization of the Palestinian lands for over 75 years in the face of the greatest military mights in the world. So it's really, really impressive, very inspiring, and especially inspiring to those people who across the world are facing also conditions of oppression, different conditions of oppression, but conditions the same that are also characterized by U.S. imperialism and that puts them right up against in a battle against US imperialist interests. So it's really a turning point, I think, for the world in its struggle against US imperialism and for what the future of humanity is going to look like. A lot of things have been called into question, and a lot more people are alert to the role that US imperialism plays in the everyday lives of people that we can relate to. And it's been incredible to see the level of humanity that people are feeling for those who are resisting and fighting back in Palestine every single day.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, Layan, as always, we really appreciate you being willing to take some time out of your very busy day. Layan Fuleihan, the Education Director of the People's Forum, thank you so much for your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.